We're surrounded here by the World War I exhibit, and if you haven't had a chance to browse through it, I highly recommend that you take that opportunity. You certainly do that after the lecture if you have not previously. And we also open on weekends. There's a sign outside, I think it's 1 to 4 when we're open on weekends. And if you come on the weekend, then there's a docent who can take you through and explain to you the various exhibits that we have here. Tonight is the third of 4 lectures that we're presenting in connection with World War I, and we're doing this in conjunction with the Weston Public Library, so thank you to them as well. Tonight's topic is the strange careers of General Pershing, in case you can't hear well. The strange careers of General Pershing and the U.S. Army, I guess in no particular order. So how many of you are already members of the society? If you can give me a show of hands. So we have a lot of non-members. Isn't that interesting? So we certainly have application forms on your way out, and don't hesitate to grab one. We'd love to have you join. And how many have attended any previous lectures and movies in this series? So we have some good returns. And last question: how many are here from the high school for extra credit?
Yeah.
Credit.
First things first, and I love that.
So I have in my hand a publication that was published 95 years ago, found in my mom's attic. We cleaned out her house. It's General Pershing's story. That's for the layman. It's technically General Pershing's report to the Secretary of War, which he wrote right after the cessation of hostilities. And it's an interesting piece. I read it this afternoon, and it really it basically tells the story of an unbroken string of U.S. Army successes and General Pershing's excellent work. So I'm sure the story might be a slightly bit more complex than that, so you may be finding out more tonight. And we're very honored tonight to have with us General Andrew Florney. Major. Did I say General? I'm sorry, I gave you a promotion already.
Not yet.
Major Andrew Florney. I'm going to get that right eventually. He is an instructor at our United States Military Academy. He has a significant background in our area. He actually instructs American history at the Academy. Major Florney has served in operational assignments around the world, including Iraq and Afghanistan. And this includes service as an operations and intelligence mentor for the Afghan National Police. We can change topics and talk about ISIL tonight.
No, I'm not allowed to. I am not allowed to.
I guess that would be a little bit asking too much. Major Florney has extensively studied cultural and social histories throughout the United States history. And tonight, as I say, he'll be speaking on the topic of General Pershing and the United States Army. Major Florney, it is our pleasure to welcome you to Weston and our Historical Society.
Thank you for having me. I've never been to Connecticut before. So I guess it's not many people say you've been to Iraq and Afghanistan, I've never been to Connecticut. And the good thing was Siri decided I should see a lot of Connecticut. And so I drove through numerous neighborhoods and back roads to get here. And when I pulled out my map, 7 to 84 is what I should have done in the first place. So, but it was a nice an hour and a half drive. The leaves are changing. There's nothing more to say about it. Now, as instructor in the military academy, I cannot talk about ISIL. And I do have to kind of give a short disclaimer. These are opinions, and this is and anything I say today is of my own thoughts and my own creation. It does not reflect the ideas of the military academy, of the Department of Defense, Department of the Army, Department of History, anybody else affiliated with the United States Army. This is mine and mine alone. So, Then Major Douglas MacArthur raced into the White House in the evening of 19 February 1917. He brought with him very big news recently telegraphed into the General Staff where he served. Major General Frederick Funston, then the number 2 general in the U.S. Army, had unexpectedly died from a massive heart attack. Finding President Wilson and Secretary of War Newton Baker together, MacArthur delivered his somber news, remembering later that, had the voice of doom spoken, the result could not have been different. The silence seemed almost like that of death. Wilson broke the silence, asking Baker who could take Funston's place, both now and the ever-increasing likelihood that the U.S. would enter the great war currently raging in Europe. As MacArthur turned to leave the room, Baker asked the young officer who he thought it should be. MacArthur recently served in Mexico in a subordinate unit to Funston's overall command and had a familiarity with the personalities of the senior officers there. I cannot speak for the Army, MacArthur answered quickly, but my own choice would be, without question, General Pershing. Wilson supposedly looked long and hard at MacArthur before almost whispering, it would be a good choice. MacArthur recounted this anecdote many years after its reported occurrence as he faded away, something he claimed that all old soldiers do. It would not be surprising if this story is apocryphal. It has all the elements of a great MacArthur story. Mac is at the center of it, moving the levers of destiny, working national and foreign policy as just a lowly major. Only someone like MacArthur would have enough verve to have the President of the United States and the Secretary of War ask his opinion on senior officer moves. True or not, and I lean towards the latter, I believe it is somewhat revelatory to what I call the strange career of General Pershing of the U.S. Army. While senior level general assignments are often political and represent a unique familiarity between policymakers and policy executors, the possibility that a well-placed combat veteran can help influence the decision, or that the Army was so small and so well-connected that junior officers could comment freely on the machinations of senior commanders, or that the death of a senior officer could throw off an entire policy program helped to elucidate a civil-military structure that, to us looking backwards, could only be defined as strange. In this light, the mobilization, training, and eventual employment of over 1 million American doughboys to France by 1918 can only be called amazing. And at the center of this transition, from strange to amazing, is one man whose career could be defined by both terms, General John Blackjack Pershing. As one biographer noted, Pershing's appointment to head the American Expeditionary Force, or AAF, marked the end of his career as a frontier cavalryman and guerrilla warrior. The overwhelming majority of his career, over 30 years, would be in these roles, and yet he is best known for his 6 years as the head of first the AAF in France, then as Chief of Staff of the Army. His transition from strange to amazing was marked with many personal reverses and political acrimony. But through his leadership and guidance, the Army changed from a constabulary force lost in the Sierra Madre to a modern army at home on the Western Front. To get a sense of how marked this transition was, it is important to get a sense of the U.S. Army on the day that MacArthur purportedly brought his tidings of death to the White House. A year prior, Wilson had ordered elements of the U.S. Army deep into northern Mexico on an expedition intended to kill or capture Francisco Pancho Villa, the Mexican warlord that had recently raided into New Mexico. The Army, at this time still occupying the Philippines, requested assistance from the southwestern states in the form of mobilizing their National Guard units and sending them to the border. Slowly, undermanned and under-equipped units arrived in El Paso and San Antonio, clad in all wool uniforms and overcoats, some blue, and drilling in the 100-degree heat. Flying columns of rapidly moving soldiers and cavalry marched into Mexico, oftentimes finding themselves lost, out of supplies, or unsure who to actually shoot at. They did shoot the Mexican Army, causing very sensitive political upheaval, which we'll talk about later. After almost a year, the expedition had little to show for itself beyond tired soldiers, complaining guardsmen, broken trucks, and a foreign policy debacle that the Wilson administration could not seem to extricate itself from. With nothing to gain and looming European war on the horizon, Wilson recalled the expedition in January 1917, and it formally closed with the last units crossing the Rio Grande on February 7th, 2 weeks before General Funston's untimely death. When word of the arrival reached the expedition's commander, he put on a brave face to his soldiers and subordinates, but eventually retreated to his tent to weep in private. Tired, frustrated, and keenly alone, Major General John Pershing probably worried that the expedition marked the unofficial end of his military career. The general had only recently seemed to warm to the idea of command. For the majority of his career prior to receiving his first general star, Pershing seemed to have one foot wearing the boots and spats of the Army, and the other the low quarters of the civilian professional. This is Pershing in 1884, 1885. This is his senior picture. A graduate of the United States Military Academy's class of 1886, Pershing was a middling scholar, ranking 30th out of a class of 77, but recognized as a natural leader. Jack, as he was then known, was also known as a hop man, a cadet that worked harder at making the numerous dances and social events of the Hudson Valley than at French, which seems to have held some ironic foreboding. He enjoyed the company of women, seemed to have been a little bit of a flirt, and after 4 years graduated at the highest cadet rank, cadet first captain. But from this auspicious start, Pershing's career stalled in a bureaucratic quicksand. The young lieutenant entered an army that had stagnated on constabulary duty on western outposts. The vicious campaigns fought against the Indian tribes of the Great Plains, now almost a decade gone by. While his first unit did hunt for Geronimo in the rugged Arizona desert, Pershing saw no action, and plenty of the mundane while on frontier duty in an army without war. And it was not as if the American people clamored for war readiness at the time. The economy was good, industrialists and business tycoons grew into the giants of American capitalism we regard them as today. 2 oceans protected us from any significant enemy, and the frontier, ostensibly closed by the 1890 census, had become increasingly civilized. Small army budgets stymied both technological advancements and officer promotions. Pershing would languish as second lieutenant for 6 years, and then spend 6 more as a first lieutenant, only promoted briefly to major during the war in Cuba, before reverting to captain in 1901, a winding process that took him over 15 years. To give you guys some perspective today, I was promoted to major at 11 years. So, very slow. Although well regarded by his superiors, by 1891, Pershing had languished on frontier outposts, much as the Army appeared to have. While visiting family, Lieutenant Pershing applied for and was accepted as the new Commandant of Cadets at the University of Nebraska. Now, University of Nebraska is interesting because it was a land-grant college. The land-grant colleges had a stipulation that each would have a Corps of Cadets. So when you look at Virginia Tech, Texas A&M, University of Nebraska, at the time, all had a Corps of Cadets. Now, these were not formalized. In an age before ROTC, Nebraska's Corps of Cadets lacked any particular structure or discipline, a reoccurring theme for many of Pershing's assignments prior to his taking them over. Pershing changed that, instilling discipline and uniformity among the Corps. But the young lieutenant also chose to better himself, earning a law degree while in Lincoln. This is one of the first instances in his career that Pershing appears to have thought about leaving the Army. A decade on and still only a lieutenant, Pershing had little to look forward to in the peacetime Army. Many times during his future exploits, Pershing ruminated upon this decision. And each time he chose to stay with an army that, more often than not, did not appear to offer him much. But Pershing decided to stay. And as so often happens, the Army rewarded this loyalty with further challenges. For Pershing, this entailed orders to Fort Assinbone, Montana, where temperatures dropped to 20 below during the winter. And to make matters worse, he was assigned to the 10th Cavalry Regiment, an all-black Buffalo Soldier outfit. Now, Pershing did not appear to adhere to the pernicious forms of racism that dominated that day, and had nothing against the black soldiers that he worked with. But he had to have known that such an assignment tended to signal a roadblock to any career advancement. The segregated army of the turn of the 20th century looked derisively upon black soldiers, often lumping their white officers along with them. Pershing made the best of the assignment, never quibbling of the nature of the unit publicly nor deriding the soldiers under him. And the black soldiers in his command appeared to have liked Pershing, respecting his even-handed treatment and level-headedness. Most importantly, for the not as quite young as he was before, lieutenant, he caught the eye of the commanding general of the Army, Nelson Miles, for whom he would serve in Washington briefly towards the end of 1896. While there, he had the opportunity to travel to New York City, in the process meeting the city's young police commissioner, Theodore Roosevelt, a rising star in the Republican Party. These chance meetings and remembrances continue to illustrate the generally unprofessional nature of the post-Civil War Army. Only such a small army would the commanding general concern himself with the dealings of a lieutenant. And although Pershing's superiors placed him in high regard, the building of close personal and political networks belied a taint of backroom dealing and glad-handing that stained the Army all the way up to 1917. By 1897, Pershing had reported to his alma mater. This was not to be a relaxing sojourn. I can tell you it is nigh impossible to get a unanimous decision among the West Point Corps cadets, except doing homework. But Pershing did. They all agreed that he was, far and away, the worst and meanest tactical officer that had ever walked the gray stone halls of the Highland Institution. Pershing demanded discipline and adherence to the standards, something that the Academy of the 1890s had slowly let slide as the successive presidential and congressional administrations debated its merits and continually parsed its funding. His company, A Company, despised him, even going so far as the old bucket of water on the open door trick. I don't know if you guys have tried this on your teachers, but leave the door part of the way open, and a bucket of water, they open it. You can go ahead and try it, it's fine. Extra credit.
Extra credit.
Double extra credits, you're already here today. Is your teacher here today? Okay, then we'll never know. He was warned by a do-gooder cadet, and so he never got wet. Supposedly the janitor did. They even went as far as to silence him in the mess hall. Hundreds of cadets sitting silently and not moving upon his entrance, the ultimate form of disrespect. Pershing called the Corps to attention and dismissed them from dinner, their meals uneaten. It was while at West Point that he was awarded the moniker Blackjack, a nod to his service with the Buffalo Soldiers. It, along with the other profane terms they called him, was not said in order to be nice. So somebody asked me about where he got the name. Blackjack was the nice version of the nickname. Leaving the ignoble West Point posting, Pershing reported back to the 10th Cavalry during April 1898, just as the regiment embarked for its role in the upcoming war in Spanish Cuba. As the regiment's quartermaster, he became ensnared in one of the biggest failures of the U.S. Army has ever experienced in its storied history. The logistical anarchy that prevailed as the Army set to wage war just 90 miles from Florida. Crates of food sat on the dock in Tampa and rotted in the sun. Units lost their warfighting equipment, and rations provided to soldiers had expired in the weeks following Appomattox. Little improved by the time the Army landed in Cuba. If anything, the hot temperatures and pestilential mosquitoes only compounded the chaos. It is a testament to Pershing's skill and potentially his underhanded efforts that the troopers of the 10th Cavalry landed in Cuba with a full combat load. 3 days worth of bacon, hardtack, and coffee, his rifle and 100 rounds of ammunition, a blanket roll and shelter half, and a poncho. Because back then, that's all you needed. That's all you needed to fight was some bacon. All other amenities would have to wait. Once ashore, the cavalry quickly moved into position to assault Kettle Hill. It and its sister hill, San Juan, dominated the entry into Santiago, the last bastion of Spanish power on the island. As the troopers moved into position, the defenders greeted them with a withering fire. In the army for 12 years, this day, July 1st, 1898, was Pershing's trial by fire. By all accounts, he served with distinction. One fellow officer accounted him, quote, as cool as a bowl of cracked ice. Pershing moved about the line, ordered to motivate those troopers cowed by the fire, and helped move them forward. By the end of the day, the black soldiers had seized Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill and unhinged the Spanish defenses, a fact often overshadowed when one considers the cavalry unit moving on its left flank, the Rough Riders, and their boisterous young leader, Theodore Roosevelt. A truce was called in the fighting, and Pershing immediately began scrounging for ammunition, equipment, food, and clothing for his regiment. One rainy night, he was nearly run over by a mule team pulling a wagon with a driver aboard who he claimed, quote, was urging his team forward with all the skill, including the forceful language of a born mule skinner. Said mule skinner gave him a ride, and when the same mule skinner hosted a dinner in Pershing's honor some years later and asked him exactly what he said, he coolly replied, President Roosevelt, I cannot repeat what you said in the lady's presence. Now, I'm sure some of you, although liking the anecdotes, are wondering, hey, I thought this was a World War I lecture. It is that. I promise I'll make it there in the end. Just give me some time. Rapidly transferring from Cuba, Pershing volunteered to head to the Philippines, one of the United States' new possessions, that had recently and haphazardly received during the late war. And this is a picture of the 10th Cavalry in Tampa as they're preparing to load the ships to go to Cuba. Pershing is at the top left. This was a meeting in, I believe, 1901 with Moro tribesmen on the island of Mindanao. A simmering war against nationalist rebels had inaugurated shortly after the U.S. and the same said rebels had united to expel the Spanish in 1898. Arriving in late 1899, he spent the next 4 years, for all intents and purposes, going quite, quote, native. A very untraditional assignment, Pershing marched deep into the island of Mindanao's tropical jungles, often in small groups of less than 10 people, and worked to build relationships with the very combative Moro tribesmen. The spit and polish officer of Lincoln, Nebraska, and West Point, New York, dissolved into the jungles, becoming the ultimate counterinsurgent. Along the way, he grew into his role of officer and leader, aspiring to a generalship at some future date. To think that he devised this goal while supping with Moro tribesmen in an isolated village where the majority of the tribesmen wanted to kill him is a striking thought indeed. By the time Pershing returned to the States in 1903, he had gained fame as one of the most able officers in the Philippines. And this was a significant distinction, for the Army had found little to be encouraged about in the islands. A supposed easy victory against a motley rebel force in 1899 had slowly devolved into a jungle insurgency throughout the archipelago. Pershing's ability to win over support of local tribes and rebel factions easily made him stand out amidst a war that turned into village burning, torture, the first verified use of waterboarding, and concentration camps. Mired in an unpopular war, the administration of Theodore Roosevelt, the same mule skinner from barely 5 years before, recommended now Captain Pershing for promotion to Brigadier General, skipping over 3 ranks and over 860 officers more senior than him. The Army's General Staff demurred, but it brought Pershing a unique label, the political officer, a label that more firmly affixed himself after he married Frances Warren, the daughter of the wealthy and powerful Republican senator from Wyoming, Francis E. Warren. This is him with Francis, his son Warren, his daughter Agnes, and the oldest daughter, which I believe is Dorothy. They had one more daughter, Margaret. I believe in 1914. From all known records, the marriage between Jack and Frankie, as he called her, was one of deep love, showing no outward signs of being a marriage of convenience. President and Mrs. Roosevelt attended their wedding in January 1905, sitting up front in the first pew. Captain and Mrs. Pershing immediately set sail for the Pacific. Jack was to serve as an American observer to the freshly begun Russo-Japanese War. This posting began an 8-year stretch of assignments that kept Pershing off and on in the Pacific, primarily the Philippines. He commanded a reinforced brigade, at that time the largest concentration of troops the Army had outside of Manila, became the military governor of the island of Mindanao, and commanded soldiers in the field against a rebel force on the same island. Most notably, Roosevelt finally worked his promotion to Brigadier General in 1906, allowing Pershing to skip over just 800 officers this time and still 3 full ranks. I would love to do that. 3 full ranks and automatic, yeah. By all accounts, Pershing merited the promotion, and such a move was not unheard of in a time of erratic promotion rates. Yet the President's conspicuous presence in the front row of Pershing's wedding left many a tongue wagging. By 1913, the Pershings returned to the States. The General mended as a rising star from the officer corps. The family settled in San Francisco at the storied Presidio, with Jack commanding the 8th Brigade stationed there. He would not stay there long, for instability in Mexico, then torn apart by a surging revolution, threatened to spill across the Rio Grande. Pershing and his command left during the spring of 1914 for Fort Bliss, just outside of El Paso, to monitor the border and the happening south of it. Now, this is one of my favorite pictures ever. So Pershing is laughing on the far right. In the middle is Pancho Villa. On the right is his bodyguard, known as the El Muerto, the murderer. And then over Pershing's left shoulder is young Lieutenant George S. Patton. So all you need is Marshall, we got them all. While here, Pershing invited Francisco Pancho Villa to the fort, where the 2 soldiers watched a military review and shared a drink. Oh, one thing I want to point out. So, Villa's jacket bows a little bit on the side because he made sure to have pistols in his pocket. Villa openly sought American support, and Pershing leaned towards it, leaned towards giving it. My impression of the general, Pershing claimed, is I think he will do great things for his beloved Mexico. Tragedy befell Pershing about a year after his meeting with Villa, just as he had decided to bring his family from the Presidio to bliss, as the war in Mexico gave no appearance of letting off. On the night of August 26, 1915, fire consumed the Pershing home in San Francisco. Warren, the couple's son, soldiers responding to the fire managed only to save Warren, the couple's son. Frankie and their 3 girls perished due to asphyxiation. Pershing reeled from the blow, retreating upon himself and busying himself with work. Friends and observers noted that Pershing, always a quiet man, would become even more solemn and reserved for the remainder of his life. Mexico helped provide a distraction for Pershing. 9 months after the fire, Villa, his drinking companion in 1914, who had also penned a letter of condolence after he received word of the tragedy in San Francisco, raided Columbus, New Mexico, killing 18 and injuring 8 others. The American public demanded retribution, a retribution the War Department had no formal plan for. The Secretary of War, Newton Baker, authorized the dispatching of 2 flying columns to search for Villa and gave overall command to Pershing. Now the picture's a little fuzzy, but again on the left, I believe that's Patton on the far left, and then Pershing in the middle. I believe this is a picture was taken crossing the Rio Grande. When Pershing was later asked why, he replied, "I was simply on the ground and more available than anyone else." This is partly true, but belies more facts than that. The General Staff, concerned by rumors that General Funston, the overall chief of the Southern Department, was a drunkard, liked and knew Pershing and vouched for him. Baker later stated that although he had never met Pershing, he was convinced that he, quote, was absolutely loyal to the policy of the civil authorities under which he was serving, end quote. A quality important for a democratic administration that had yet to find a solid footing in terms of foreign policy and had only recently defeated the greatest living Republican of the time, Roosevelt, who we all remember sat in the front row at Pershing's wedding. Pershing, perhaps glad for a respite from the memories of last year's fire, jumped into preparation for the operation. Much as in Cuba, however, logistics turned into a nightmare. Enraged at the violation of their sovereignty, yet glad the U.S. planned on defeating Villa, the Mexican government forbade the use of the north-south railroads into Chihuahua. Forced to rely on horse and buggy or the brand new Dodge trucks coming out of Detroit, they did not have Hemis. They didn't have Hemis. I think they had 32 horsepower, so kind of like a bike. The quartermasters for the expedition soon collapsed under the strain of supplying the force. Columbus proved to be neither a metropolis nor a transportation node, and few good roads existed in Chihuahua to move supplies, horses, and soldiers. Pershing pressed on, crossing the border in March 1916, and immediately aware of what he termed the, quote, barely disguised ill will of the population. It may be that Pershing, the jungle warrior, felt comfortable driving deep into hostile territory, but this expedition was no 10-man team looking for Moro chieftains. Pershing could never again expect the support of the population at any point during the campaign. In fact, the expedition could never really expect anything. Supposedly granted free passage by both the Mexican government and the army, U.S. forces clashed with Mexican troops at Parral 6 weeks into the expedition. A campaign to find Villa had instead found the Mexican army. With patrols in constant contact with regular Mexican soldiers and large Mexican units moving north of the border, ostensibly to stop banditry, but potentially looking north of the Rio Grande, the Americans decided to consolidate their lines. 2 months in, the expedition had appeared to have become at least a farce, and at its most, an all-out war. The Wilson administration had lost its taste for the Mexican fiasco and agreed that events had far outpaced the capture of Villa. By January of 1917, Secretary Baker authorized withdrawal. Pershing had hoped that the presence of an American force in Mexico could be used to gain some concessions for security or trade. Instead, the force simply left, crossing the border much as it had done less than a year before, this time in the opposite direction. says the Pershing Punitive Expedition of the Great Top. Now, that's a cartoon caricature of Villa because he had notionally been wounded in the leg at some point. So you see he's got a crutch and he's wound right there and he's throwing knives at Pershing who's tied to the hands. What had the expedition proved? Operationally and strategically, very little. While the common perception of the campaign as being slow, lugubrious, and taxing are somewhat overwrought, the calling up of the National Guard to secure the border was regarded as a fiasco by all involved, exposing significant weaknesses in a system of mobilization that looked to be stretched to the breaking point very soon. Logistics never really caught up to the facts of the mobilization, and stories proliferated, again, of missing stocks and rotting food. The nature of the campaign also disincentivized a level of modernization. While Pershing made use of trucks and airplanes throughout the campaign, the rapid movement of the expedition and its bandit hunting nature precluded developments in armored cars, heavy artillery, and machine guns, all being used on the Western Front by 1917. As U.S. Army planners gauged the prospects of entry into World War I during the spring of 1917, they must have conceded that the Army embodied exactly what it was, a provisional force, not far from the constabulary duties of the late 19th century, that had issues projecting power 200 miles beyond its border, and had basically conceded to a stalemate against a nation fighting itself in an internal civil war. The Army did evince some positives during the campaign. As opposed to the slow, bumbling advances often portrayed by the press, Pershing's flying columns moved quickly and with verve. The regular Army exhibited discipline throughout the campaign, and junior leaders several times showed a tendency towards seizing the initiative in the absence of clear orders. As stated before, Pershing did oversee the first steps toward modernization of the force, incorporating air trucks and even motorcycles into the advance. I had a picture that I didn't bring with me, but it's a motorcycle with a machine gun loaded as a sidecar, which I think would be the best ever. The expedition, although fraught with its own problems, showed a marked departure from the Army that fumbled its way through Cuba not quite 20 years prior. That said, as Pershing ruminated about his future after the expedition, he had to have viewed it with some trepidation. The press linked Pershing with the expedition from the start, some papers going as far as naming it Pershing's expedition. Pershing had gained promotion to Major General during the campaign, but this garnered him little solace. Still depressingly alone, he had to acknowledge the possibility that, as the nation slid fully into the Great War, there's a good chance that he will be left at home. As we know, this was not to be. Two main reasons for selecting Pershing to overall command of the AAF stood out for the Wilson administration. First, and the most pragmatic of the two, Pershing was the only general in the U.S. Army that had commanded a large contingent of forces and had experience with campaigning. Granted, this was only 11,000 soldiers, a far cry from the planned millions, but the fact of the matter was that the officers that led the mobilization and campaigning of the Spanish-American War, inauspicious as it was, were all dead or retired. The Army resorted to constabulary duty and counterinsurgency operations after the war, and a generation of officers came of age with little experience managing units above the battalion level. Early measures have been made to build professionalization within the officer corps, first with the Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, and then at the War College at Carlisle Barracks. But this transition had not yet expanded fully throughout the Army, and had yet to be validated in combat. Wilson and Baker recognized that any issues of the punitive expedition had lain at the national level, while well above the control of Pershing, the ground commander. Second, Pershing, despite the rumblings during the early part of the 20th century, was not political. He had never publicly stated any opposition to the Wilson administration and their policies, even as he questioned his handling of the Lusitania sinking in 1915 and the final handling of the punitive expedition in private. Baker repeatedly acknowledged Pershing's apolitical demeanor, a breath of fresh air when one considers the political movements of many other senior commanders within the military at that time. It also helped that, even as a man without party, Pershing still shared clear political connections with the Republicans and its old warhorse, Roosevelt. Did we mention again where Roosevelt sat at Pershing's wedding? The general's appointment served as a ready means to build political unity over the potentially contentious issue of declaring war. helping to craft a unified front for a Wilson administration that had yet evinced a foreign policy resolve. This is Pershing in the campaign hat, excuse me, the service cap, and on the right in the kind of teepee looking hat, the formal name, a garrison cap, that's right, garrison cap, is Major General Summerall, the commander of the 1st Infantry Division. And Pershing's favorite division was the 1st Infantry Division, because the units that he served with in Mexico, he hand-selected for the 1st Infantry Division. This is in France. Pershing readily accepted the appointment, a promotion, and the responsibility of building an army from scratch. At the April 1917 declaration of war, the nation could call on approximately 270,000 officers and soldiers to man its new army, only reaching this number by fully detaching the regular army from its constabulary and guard duties and mobilizing the entire National Guard. This is a far cry from the anticipated millions needed to make an impact on the Western Front. And manpower proved only one of many issues for the AAF. The War Department had yet to agree on which machine gun best would serve the Army's needs in France, although they had been used ubiquitously by the contending European powers for over 3 years. Contracts had to be arranged so that American soldiers could fire French cannons, drive French tanks, fly British airplanes, and wear British helmets. Given that the majority of his career had entailed duty either on the frontier or against smaller bands of rebels, tribesmen, or bandits, one could potentially have excused Pershing if he had lagged behind in creating a professional and modern force to fight in the trenches. To his credit, Pershing rose to the occasion. From the onset, Pershing placed planning and logistics as his top priorities. He had witnessed too many operations and campaigns installed due to lack of well-thought-out orders and a lack of supplies. He assembled a staff of superstars around him, to include George Marshall, Dwight Eisenhower, and George Patton. He drove home the primacy of planning among these junior officers, turned the tables on the notion of the officer leading the charge, and inevitably being killed, that had dominated American arms since the Civil War. He ostensibly took over the French rail system, improving a national infrastructure that had not been updated to meet the realities of bring millions of doughboys across the Atlantic. If you ever go to France and you take a rail line that goes from east to west, thank Pershing. As these soldiers arrived, he established staff schools on the Leavenworth model to train newly commissioned officers and National Guard officers on the dynamics of battalion above operations, which no one else besides Pershing had really ever done in the United States Army. He encouraged observation of English and French units and established training schools that taught individual soldiers the dynamics of trench warfare. Other training courses taught American technicians how to use cannons, fire machine guns, dig trenches, integrate tank and infantry attacks, and respond to gas attacks, mainly through Stubby the dog. Pershing demanded a steep learning curve for the AAF, and for the most part, it met it. Central to Pershing's concept of the AAF was the notion that it would fight as its own independent body. This ran counter to the notions of the French and the British. From the moment of the war's declaration, both sides had sought an amalgamation, or the infusion of fresh American bodies into British and French units. This was the last thing that Pershing wanted. He viewed his new allies cagily, seeing them both as battle-scarred by 3 years of war and unable to think past the tunnel vision of attrition-minded trench warfare. The United States did not intend to send millions of its loved ones overseas to simply die in the meat grinder fashion that had typified the actions on the Somme and at Verdun. Possibly as a reward for his apolitical nature, Pershing received full carte blanche from Wilson and Baker to handle the AAF as he saw fit, pushing back against Allied demands of amalgamation. While Pershing did concede to early arriving American divisions, serving in the line to help stymie the German spring offensive of 1918, he was finally granted an independent portion of the battlefield and full autonomy for the AAF within their Allied war plans. This is the centerpiece, I believe, of that photo over there. This is looking into the no man's land prior to the Meuse-Argonne offensive. As the 1st U.S. Army waited with bated breath to attack into the St. Mihiel salient on 12 September 1918 and execute the first wholly independent American operation of the war, Pershing stood behind the front lines and waited until 1 a.m. when 3,000 artillery pieces roared against German positions. 4 hours later, Junior officers blew their whistles, and the soldiers went over the top to smash German positions in the exposed salient. Pershing, unable to ascertain the full extent of the advance in the misty weather, must have reflected on how far he and the U.S. Army had come. The army that had chased Geronimo in 1886, and for the most part failed, had chased Pancho Villa 30 years later, and for the most part failed. Less than 2 years later, 6 U.S. divisions in France attacked directly into veteran German combat units. The stagnant army of 30 years had undergone massive changes in less than 2. And most of these changes could be attributed to one man, Blackjack Pershing. That Pershing does not receive due credit for this Herculean effort, often being overshadowed by those that came before him, Grant, Sherman, and Lee, and those that came after him, who he mentored and trained, Marshall, Eisenhower, MacArthur, and Patton, is, in a word, strange. So with that, any questions?
What is his rank at the end of World War I?
This is interesting. He was Pershing is the only 6-star general in the history of the United States. He was a 4-star general when he went over to France in 1917, and he was promoted to 5 stars to compete with the British and French field marshals.
Is that a permanent rank or a temporary rank?
The 6-star?
Yes.
I would have to look, but it was given by Congress, as authorized by Warren G. Harding as recognition for his service, and when he was made Chief of Staff of the Army. And then I believe that rank was done away with toward the end of the 1920s.
So as Chief of Staff, he was a 6-star general.
He wore the rank of 6-star general. Yes.
Thank you.
Did I win a trivia bet for you? He actually outranked George Washington. And maybe that's why they did away with it. I'm not sure.
Well, that's basically why the 5-star generals were formed in World War II. Is that correct? To compete with the ranks of the European.
Right, and at that point you had the 4-star general, much like we have now. You have your 4-star generals and no 5-star. And then I believe in 1944, a little bit after Operation Market Garden, Churchill created a rank for Montgomery, Field Marshal of the Empire, so that he would outrank Eisenhower. And then Eisenhower was promoted to 5-star in Commander-in-Chief. Sometimes your allies. So, yes, sir.
The controversy surrounding the fact that he led the army into war far longer with many greater casualties than that stage of the war seemed to be warranted, at least from the perspective of other generals at the time and historians since. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Now I kind of got us up to, I kind of left the climax hanging, right? The United States Army and Pershing in general, Pershing particularly, looked at the British and the French, as like I said, as being overly cautious and scared of casualties, and kind of wedded to this idea of trench warfare. And so he and his staff planned on what was called open warfare doctrine. The idea that you would expand your lines, you would push responsibility down to the lowest level, allowing junior officers to use their initiative and their leadership to capture positions. So more generalized orders than opposed to the very regimented time hack orders of the British and the French Army. When they attacked into St. Mihiel, the German units there were preparing to retreat, and they were basically, this was seen as a rest position for them. And so when they attacked into the St. Mihiel salient, it appeared to work. When they attacked in the Meuse-Argonne, it did not work. And there was a significant amount of casualties commensurate to the Somme and Verdun. On a smaller time frame and to a smaller scale. So percentage-wise, it was equal to what the British and the French had seen predominantly in 1915. Now, this signals the end of the war. So the narrative that Pershing is taking out of this is, we won, we broke the back of the Germans. Now, if the Germans had not broken around the time of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, it would have been interesting to see if that level of attrition would be sustainable. And I think that's one of the narratives that later comes up, particularly starting in the 1940s and 50s, is that Pershing was not the best field commander. He's a very good administrator, but the reality is he had a bunch of officers who had not led in combat or led big units in combat. And so when you look at the Meuse-Argonne offensive as well, where there's a stiff German resistance, you see a lot of unit cohesion breakdown, a lot of crossing of boundary lines, misidentifications, and the U.S. Army tended to make up for this in combat with, square peg round hole mentality. Just keep going at it, keep going forward. Whereas the British and the French, a little bit more regimented and more cautious. By 1917, 1918, we're seeing less casualties on the battlefield. Although the French army broke in 1917 with the Nivelle divisions and corps that basically mutinied, as well as the British outside of Ypres, I believe, in late 1917 or early 1918, which British divisions I believe had to be taken out of line for Canadian units. So John Keegan's book, First World War, says that every nation, except the United States, had an army that broke due to the attrition-based warfare of the Western Front. So if that would have happened to the Americans if the war continued further on, I couldn't say. But there were 7,000 casualties during the St. Hill offensive and tens of thousands in Meuse-Argonne.
So we started the war with 300,000 or so soldiers, and we had to get up to a couple of million.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, what was the draft instituted right away to do that?
It was. The draft was instituted right away, and have you guys ever, young guys, have you ever heard the term slacker? That comes from World War I. For people who do not register at selective service, or if they're local draft officer, they were termed slackers. And so in New York City, I want to say in late 1917, they call out the New York National Guard and police. They started at the top of Manhattan, and they worked their way down to, what was it at that point? At that part, 5 Points, the Bowery. And if you didn't have a draft card, they threw you in prison. He gave you a draft card. So this was where the draft there was volunteers, but the draft was a significant portion as well.
So then they sent Pershing over, if I recall correctly, without the army, sort of in advance, to figure out what the French and English were doing and how he could be helpful. And then it's interesting, in this speech they say that they weren't even sure how big. He had to basically create an army. How big is an army?
Right.
So,
No, and I think that's when we talk about Pershing being selected because he led this huge contingent of 11,000 soldiers, where he was going to be putting together an army of several million. But nobody else had done 11,000 in one, right? So he was it. And so there was, and the army had wedded itself to a regimental system. 3 or 4 battalions or squadrons making up a regiment. This is how they fought, because this is all the soldiers they needed. And so when it developed that they needed regimental combat teams, divisions, and corps and armies, they just hadn't been written. And so when Pershing goes over to France in 1917, he just brings his staff. And he sits there with his staff and he says, okay, how's this going to work? And so when we talk about the American Expeditionary Force, it's kind of this big umbrella organization. And not until, I want to say, July or August of 1918 is the first army created. And this is composed of 6 primary divisions under 2 corps, because they finally built the manpower to do that. It's made up of predominantly regular army units. The National Guard units and units kind of created after the war started make up the Second Army, which are also the ones that attacked the Meuse-Argonne that suffered quite a bit of casualties, because the regular units are pulled out of the line and the National Guard put in the newer units. So, yeah, let's go right here.
Did you say that when American soldiers entered the war in 1917, did they use contracts for weapons from France and planes from Britain?
They used French cannons and primarily French tanks.
And why didn't?
Because we didn't have any.
Okay.
We had factories, but we hadn't made tanks. We hadn't made artillery. And so this is why I bring in the part about the Mexican expedition. you don't need 105mm cannons to shoot at 3 guys on horses. And so we don't have that. At the same time, the Germans have I think 280mm tank, cannons on trains, railway guns. Yeah, and so it's an issue of scale. Now, by 1919, you see a lot of these things being made in America. They take the French or English designs and then they start mass producing them. And so by the end of the war, you have a lot of reconstituted French and British units that are having British-style guns made in Detroit. I think Ford actually experiments with making armored cars, and the first American tank, which I think is the Mark II.
The whole gas electric.
Say what?
The whole gas electric, it wasn't produced at all since it was a pile of trash.
Okay, well, yeah. I mean, they experimented with it, but they had the British and the French models. The French had a smaller tank than the British. It was a 2-man. That's what Patton used, and he actually attempted to use in the St. Mihiel offensive. And then we used the Sopwith and the Spad British airplanes. Let it go right here, and then we'll work right around. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll get you in a minute. Go here.
Let me ask you a very broad political question.
Okay, good.
In World War I,
Mhm.
it took us 3 years before we got involved in the war.
Mhm.
Europeans have been battling since 1940. In World War II, it took us 2 years to get involved basically in the same war.
Okay. Mhm. Why?
Today, it takes us 3 months to get involved in Syria. Why is that?
How much time do we have?
That helps.
Can I talk about that one when the camera's not on? I can talk about World War I and World War II. I believe that Franklin Roosevelt was Wilson. And so when you see the steps that he's taking, particularly in the Atlantic, in the Battle of Atlantic, early on, I think he's viewing what's happening in Europe, very exact same war. And so I think he is preparing for, and we see this May 1941, we basically have a kind of undeclared naval war going on in the North Atlantic. And so I think that Roosevelt sees himself going down a road similar to Wilson. Unrestricted submarine warfare is going to force his hand, and the American commitment may just be naval. This may not be a reinvasion of the continent, but I think he sees this going much in the way that Wilson had. He was Undersecretary of the Navy under Wilson, and so I think this is his conception. And then Pearl Harbor, while there have been rumblings of the Japanese, I don't think that he was prepared for that, and so that kind of juked his timeline a little bit. But we see this, the Germany First policy, the emphasis on the Battle of the Atlantic. I think he was very much Wilsonian in that regard. And I think a lot of this goes to trade for the most part. 1914, we're trading as much as everybody. And the British blockade, I think by numbers, kind of steers a lot of our trade to England. If you want to make money, you can't go through the blockades, you're going to go to England. And it's the British do an outstanding propaganda campaign, basically with Lusitania, with mines, with submarine warfare, that really turns the American public. And I think the Zimmerman telegram seals the deal, and I think it's often overshadowed. I have gone back and forth on this. I can't tell. I don't necessarily believe that the Zimmerman telegram was outreach from Germany to Mexico.
Does everyone understand what the Zimmerman telegram was?
Okay, Zimmerman telegram, British intelligence, and this is very convenient. British intelligence decoded this telegram supposedly from Germany to Mexico, saying, if the United States goes to war with us and you side with us, we'll give you back Texas, Arizona, California, and New Mexico. This is, as far as I know, and if there's anybody here in the room who can confirm it for me, please. I have not heard confirmation that that this is official German policy. And so there are several thoughts that this may have been a double agent, that this may have been a manifestation of British Secret Service. But it conveniently shows up, and the British sure waste no time in showing it to us. And so I think when you look at the problems that the Wilson administration was having in Mexico, this is the icing on the cake. going forward. And this helps them to really kind of this is the nail in the coffin. Because you got to remember, you know, November 1916, Wilson gets elected on "I kept us out of war." Less than 6 months later, it is a war to save all of humanity. So I think that that's a very quick transition. That I think FDR is waiting for something like that to happen. And we can talk the other stuff later. Yes, sir.
Back to Black Jack.
Yes, sir.
He made his way up in the political world of Washington by agreeing to take orders from either side.
Mhm.
That was basically, here's a Republican who will work with Democrats.
Right.
Do you think after the war is over and the veterans are routed from Washington D.C. when they demand their war bonus,
Mm-hmm.
do you think that impugns his reputation as once again taking orders from up above?
Well, by the time you're talking about the bonus army.
That's right.
So, for those of you who don't know, the bonus army, at the onset of the Depression, much like every time there's an economic downturn, the veterans get it worse. And so, after World War I, the veterans of World War I, because we didn't want to put them on the dole and then just to not work, because heaven forbid we take care of veterans, we take their pension and we split it in half. The first up front and then a bonus to come later. And I believe it was 20 years after the cessation of the war, so it would have been 1940-41 was they would receive it. However, late 1920, early 1930s, 31 I believe, because they marched on Washington and they demand their bonus because they can point to unemployment data in which veterans are being much more hurt by the economic downturn than the average citizen. And they say, hey, give us the bonus now, give us the rest of our bonus, that way we can feed our families. And when they're told no, and Hoover refuses to even meet with them, they can't basically, in an early form of the Occupy movement, they encamp right off the mall. Hoover calls out the DC police. The DC police are strongly made out of former veterans, and they will not take action against the bonus army. So he calls MacArthur and says, MacArthur, will you kind of clear these guys out? And MacArthur says, absolutely, I'll clear them out. And he says, Patton, what do you want to do? And Patton's like, let me get some tanks. And so they get some tanks, and the soldiers put on bayonets, and I think this is probably one of the darkest moments of our history. We push the veterans, the bonus army, into the Potomac River and set fire to their stuff and beat them. At this point, Pershing is retired. Following his retirement, he's very active in veterans organizations. I couldn't tell you if he had any comments directly related to the bonus army. I couldn't. I'm not sure. But I know he's very active in the VFW, the American Legion, following the war. And so he becomes spokesman for these groups. I think he transitions very quickly to being an advocate for veterans. And I'm not 100% sure what his response to that would be. MacArthur's vilified in the press, and the press, he actually says that he's going to tell two of the reporters he's going to sue him for slander. And they said, if you sue us for slander, we'll tell them about your mistress you've got in the Astoria Hotel downtown. So he's like, oh, okay, I guess I'm not going to sue you. And then he goes back to the Philippines.
Any more questions?
Yes, sir.
Was Pershing in the Second American Expedition reports to Russia?
No, he was not. So you've got the elements of the U.S. Army that go into Siberia and secure Vladivostok and basically side with White Russians at the end of during the Russian Civil War. He's not involved. Fairly quickly after World War I, he comes back and he takes over as chief of staff of the army, and he basically oversees the demobilization now of these millions of soldiers who were in France.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Would you comment on the influence of Pershing in renewing the awarding of the Purple Heart?
Yes.
It had not been awarded for some time.
Sporadically, and it hadn't been codified. And so I had a friend who's at West Point now who's going to law school, who actually went back in the post-Civil War era, and he found out that most of the medals of honor that were awarded post-Civil War era were actually awarded illegally. So there was not a codified awards process or a clear codified awards process during this time period. And so what Pershing does is, because we do have a lot of casualties, he reinstitutes the Purple Heart and sets up kind of the the measurements in which we grant it. So, the sworn statement and a doctor's certificate, you will receive a Purple Heart. And so he does reinstitute this as a way to, the reality is, saving the hill, in the course of a couple of days, you have 7,000 casualties. And so, that's a way to honor them, that's what he does. Yes, sir?
Just one last question.
No problem.
What was the major campaign in the First World War where the French unleashed that tremendous artillery barrage that went on for a couple of days? It was the largest artillery barrage that was ever taken.
I believe it was at Verdun. I believe it was at Verdun. And I think that was the one that dropped the height of the train by 2 feet. So I believe it was at Verdun in 1915. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
What became of General Pershing's son, Warren?
Warren, I'm not sure. Actually, no, that's incorrect. He goes to Wall Street. And then his two sons, so Pershing's grandsons, both go in the Army. I want to say his son John became a colonel and became influential in the late 80s, early 90s, in reforming the ROTC system. And then the other one, I'm not 100% sure, but I know one died in Vietnam. How can I forget? One died in Vietnam, the other one reached the rank of colonel, and I believe died in '99 from complications from heart surgery. Anyone else?
Thank you very much. Also, I want to say, based on your report tonight, I'm going to recommend you to the rank of general.
I don't want it. Not with questions like that.
So, folks, there is, as I said, you can feel free to browse the museum. We have a lovely room full of refreshments over here with cookies and iced tea, etc. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
General of the Army. Then, in 1976,